I was standing in my own home, surrounded by familiar faces, when the pain hit my chest so hard I could barely breathe. I asked my daughter to call 911. She didn't hesitate. She snapped at me, told me to stop overreacting, and took my phone away while everyone watched. In that moment, something deeper than fear broke inside me. It wasn't just my heart failing. It was the realization that the person I trusted most was willing to let me suffer, maybe even die, to stay in control. And what happened next changed everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Helen Whitmore. I am 69 years old, a retired public high school teacher, and I have lived in the same quiet neighborhood on the west side of Madison, Wisconsin for more than 40 years. This house still creaks the way it did when my husband and I first moved in, when our daughter was small and life felt wide open. The rhythm of my days has slowed with age, but it has also grown quieter, more predictable, almost carefully contained. Most mornings begin the same way. I wake just after sunrise, grind coffee beans by hand, and read the local paper at the kitchen table where the varnish has worn thin beneath my elbows. When the weather allows, I step outside to water the small garden behind the house, the one my husband David planted before he passed. After that, I take a slow walk around the block, nodding to neighbors who recognize me but do not really know me. It is a gentle life, one I worked decades to earn. David died 3 years ago from a sudden stroke. He was practical to the end, the kind of man who planned for contingencies long before they were necessary. His passing left me with a deep ache and a carefully organized set of financial accounts, including a personal investment fund he managed quietly, without show. He believed security meant freedom, especially for women who had spent their lives taking care of others. At the time, I thought that freedom would protect me from everything else. My daughter, Rachel Whitmore, does not live far away, though sometimes it feels like she inhabits a different world entirely. At 42, she is a senior director of human resources for a private hospital network, always polished, always busy, always in control. People admire her easily. They talk about her dedication, her intelligence, the way she balances a demanding career with family obligations. When they speak about me, it is usually in reference to her, as if I am an extension of her accomplishments rather than a person in my own right. Rachel is married to Tom Larson, a quiet man who blends into rooms by design. He does not argue, does not interrupt, and rarely takes the lead in conversations. They have one child, Noah, who is 17 now and taller than I am. Noah spends more time at my house than at any of his friends, often sitting with me in the living room, helping me with small tasks, or simply occupying the same space in comfortable silence. He notices things other people miss. When Rachel visits, she arrives with intention, grocery bags placed just so, a quick hug timed neatly for a photograph. Within minutes, her phone is angled discreetly, capturing images that tell a story of dutiful care and closeness. I smile when prompted, though the expressions often feel borrowed, rehearsed. The posts always receive praise. I read the comments later, feeling oddly distant from the version of myself they describe. I tell myself that this is how modern families work now, that visibility has replaced intimacy, and that I should be grateful Rachel shows up at all. I remind myself not to complain, not to appear needy, not to disrupt the order she maintains so effortlessly. After all, I raised her to be strong, to take charge. Somewhere along the way, I confused that success with safety. Lately, though, I have sensed a subtle shift, something I cannot quite name. A faint tightening, not in my chest yet, but in the atmosphere around me. A feeling that my role in my own life is quietly being rearranged. I push the thought aside, label it unnecessary worry, and return to my routines. At this stage in life, I tell myself, peace is found in staying small, staying agreeable, staying out of the way. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what first looks like concern soon turns into something far more unsettling. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The days following that uneasy awareness slipped back into their familiar shape, as if nothing had shifted at all. I kept my routines intact because routines have a way of convincing you that everything is still under control. I woke early, brewed coffee, and moved through the house with careful efficiency. It was on one of those ordinary mornings, while reaching for a mug near the sink, that I felt the first tightness beneath my breastbone. It was not sharp enough to frighten me, just an odd pressure that lingered for a few seconds before fading. I stood still, hand on the counter, waiting for it to pass, and it did. I told myself it was nothing more than stiffness or cold air settling in my chest. I considered calling my primary care doctor that afternoon, the thought forming briefly and then drifting away. Appointments took time, and I had spent years telling myself not to run to specialists over every ache. When I mentioned the sensation casually during a phone call with Rachel later that day, she dismissed it before I had finished describing it. Her tone was light, almost amused, as if she were humoring a child. She reminded me that anxiety can feel physical and suggested I focus on relaxing more. I let the subject drop, feeling faintly embarrassed for even bringing it up. A few days later, the pressure returned while I was carrying a full laundry basket up the stairs. Halfway up, my breathing shortened, and I had to stop, gripping the banister until the sensation eased. A thin sheen of sweat gathered at my temples, though the house was cool. I waited longer this time before moving again, listening closely to my body while simultaneously urging it not to cause a fuss. When I reached the top of the stairs, I folded the laundry as usual and said nothing to anyone. That evening, Noah stopped by after school to help me move boxes in the basement. As we worked, he spoke quietly, carefully choosing his words. He mentioned that Rachel had been asking him questions about my accounts, about whether I knew where everything was kept, and whether it might be easier for her to help organize things. He said it did not sound urgent, just persistent. I felt a strange combination of gratitude and unease. Gratitude that Noah had noticed, and unease because it confirmed something I had half felt, but not named. Not long after that, Rachel came over unannounced. While I prepared tea, she wandered through the living room, her attention lingering on the old wooden cabinet where David had always stored important documents. When she noticed me watching, she smiled and changed the subject, but her interest did not go unnoticed. Later, I heard her on the phone in the hallway, her voice low and clipped. I caught only fragments, a mention of signing paperwork and streamlining control, before she fell silent and emerged with an expression too neutral to mean nothing. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying small moments that had once seemed harmless. The way Rachel had waved off my concern about chest discomfort, the way she spoke of organization as if it were a necessity I no longer understood, the way she assumed, gently but firmly, that she knew what was best. I felt the ache return, faint but present, and rested my palm against my chest until it eased. In the end, I postponed calling my doctor. I told myself I was being dramatic, that peace in my family mattered more than poking at possibilities. But beneath that reasoning sat an emerging truth I was not ready to face yet. My body was signaling something, and my daughter was already deciding how that signal would be interpreted. If you're still watching and noticing how small warning signs begin to pile up when no one takes them seriously, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. What's coming next is when those quiet red flags can no longer be ignored. Let's continue to chapter 3. Rachel was the one who suggested the gathering. She called on a Wednesday evening, sounding upbeat and decisive, saying it might be nice to bring everyone together for a small family get-together at my house. She framed it as a way to honor what would have been my parents' wedding anniversary, a detail I had nearly forgotten but felt obligated to acknowledge. I agreed before fully thinking it through, partly because saying no always seemed to create more tension than it avoided, and partly because I still hoped shared time might soften whatever distance had grown between us. By Saturday afternoon, my quiet home no longer felt like my own. Coats lined the hallway, unfamiliar shoes clustered near the door, and voices echoed off the walls in overlapping conversation. People I rarely saw moved comfortably through rooms that usually held only my thoughts. Several of Rachel's colleagues from the hospital were there, people who nodded at me politely but focused their attention on her. The energy in the house felt sharp and restless, the opposite of the calm I depended on. Rachel moved through the crowd with ease, directing people where to set dishes, when to sit, and how the schedule would unfold. She spoke confidently, her laughter bright and practiced. When she looped an arm around me to introduce me to someone new, she spoke about me in a tone that felt indulgent rather than respectful. She mentioned how I worried easily, how I tended to read too much into minor symptoms, how she was always reminding me not to panic over small things. The words were light, but their impact settled heavily in my chest. I smiled when expected, although a quiet embarrassment burned beneath the surface. These were my private moments, reshaped into anecdotes meant to comfort others and highlight her patience. I felt myself shrinking, my role reduced to background color for her story. At some point, I slipped into the kitchen under the pretense of checking on the food, grateful for the brief separation. That was when the pressure returned. It started as a dull, spreading sensation beneath my ribs, stronger than before, forcing me to pause with both hands flat against the counter. The room seemed to tilt ever so slightly, and for a moment I focused only on breathing evenly. I told myself it would pass if I stayed still. When it did not ease right away, I walked back toward the living room, seeking out Rachel's familiar figure. She was in mid-conversation, smiling at one of her colleagues. I waited until she turned, then leaned in and told her quietly that I was not feeling well. Her response was immediate and restrained by irritation rather than concern. She urged me to sit down and not make a scene, reminding me how many people had taken time out of their weekend to be there. I nodded, though I had not asked for attention, only help. As the evening continued, I heard her mention my tendency to overreact again, this time with a chuckle that drew knowing smiles from the people around her. The ache in my chest pulsed in time with my growing realization. What troubled me most was not just the physical discomfort, but the clarity of understanding that formed alongside it. My pain had become a convenient detail in her narrative, something she could dismiss or display depending on what suited her in the moment. I lowered myself into a chair, pressing my palm lightly against my side where the tightness lingered. Around me, conversation flowed uninterrupted. The house was full, yet I had never felt more alone within its walls. As I watched Rachel command the room, I understood that this gathering was not an isolated moment, but the beginning of something larger. My life, my health, and even my voice were being interpreted through someone else's authority, and the realization settled over me with a weight I could not ignore. If you're still watching and feeling the tension rise as private moments turn painfully public, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here. Because the next chapter is when denial turns dangerous. Now, Let's move on to chapter 4. The gathering continued as if nothing were wrong. Plates were passed, laughter rose and fell, and music hummed quietly through the living room. I sat still for a few minutes, hoping that if I remained calm, the pressure in my chest might loosen on its own. Instead, it deepened. What had been an uncomfortable tightness grew heavier, more deliberate, like a hand pressing inward and refusing to lift. Each breath required effort, measured and shallow, and I became acutely aware of how far away help suddenly felt. I tried to ground myself the way I had always done when things felt out of control. I rested my hands in my lap, counted my breaths, reminded myself that panic would only make everything worse. But this was not panic. The sensation did not rise and fall the way fear usually did for me. It stayed, unwavering, and each minute made it harder to ignore the quiet warning spreading through my body. Eventually, I understood that sitting still was no longer an option. This was not something I could wait out. Slowly, carefully, I pushed myself up from the chair, steadying my weight until the room stopped tilting. My coat hung near the front door, and inside its pocket was my phone. The thought of dialing emergency services felt drastic, but the alternative felt reckless. I moved toward the hallway with deliberate steps, determined not to draw attention. I had just reached into my pocket when Rachel was suddenly there. Her movement was quick, sharp, and final. She took the phone from my hand without hesitation, her grip firm enough to startle me. Her face tightened in frustration rather than concern, and her voice cut through the air loud enough for several people nearby to hear. She accused me of overreacting, of turning a minor moment into something dramatic, of embarrassing her in front of her guests. I tried to explain that this felt different, that I was struggling to breathe, that I needed help. The words came out unevenly, lost beneath the noise of the room and the certainty in her tone. My knees trembled, and I reached for the wall to steady myself, feeling the boundaries of my own home slip further out of reach. From the corner of my vision, I saw Noah standing a few steps away, his face pale and tense. I did not see him move at first, but I sensed it when Rachel turned sharply toward the kitchen. She had noticed. Later, I would understand that Noah had tried to call for help himself, slipping toward the edge of the room with his phone in hand. Rachel intercepted him just as decisively as she had stopped me. She pulled him aside, her voice low and urgent, reminding him of consequences meant to keep him silent. The fear on his face was unmistakable. Tom hovered near the doorway, uncertainty written into his posture. He opened his mouth as if to intervene, then closed it again when Rachel glanced his way. His silence felt heavy, another door closing quietly while I stood there, exposed and struggling. At that moment, it became clear that it was not just one decision being made against me. It was a system of control I had underestimated, built from years of confidence and compliance. My phone was gone. Noah was frozen. Tom would not speak. The room was full, yet every path toward help had been deliberately blocked. The pressure in my chest intensified, radiating outward, and I lowered myself back into a chair because my legs would no longer support me. Around me, conversation resumed in uneasy fragments, people avoiding my eyes, waiting for someone else to take charge. I felt something shift inside me, deeper than fear. It was the certainty that I had tried to save myself and failed, not because help was unavailable, but because the people closest to me had decided I did not need it. As the minutes dragged on, I realized with stark clarity that if I survived what was happening, it would not be because of my family's protection. Whatever came next would arrive from outside this room, beyond the influence that had just proven how fragile my place within it truly was. If you're still watching and your heart dropped when that call for help was stopped, comment number 4 below, so I know you're with me. Because what happens next is the moment everything breaks, and there's no turning back. Let's go to chapter 5. I could no longer stay upright. What began as pressure turned into something overwhelming, spreading across my chest and into my shoulders, heavy and consuming. Each breath felt incomplete, as though my lungs could not fully expand no matter how hard I tried. I sank deeper into the chair, my vision narrowing at the edges, the room wavering in slow, uneven movements. It felt as though my body was steadily slipping away from me, piece by piece. The sounds around me grew distorted, voices blurred together, rising and falling without meaning. I heard my name at least once, spoken with uncertainty rather than urgency. Someone shifted a chair. Another person whispered something I could not make out. The room was full of people, yet I felt profoundly isolated, caught inside my own failing body, while everyone waited for someone else to decide what to do. The pain surged, sharp and urgent, forcing a small sound from my throat as my grip loosened on the arm of the chair. I slid downward before I could stop myself, landing on the floor in an awkward heap. The coolness of the wood against my cheek was the last sensation that felt clear. Above me, movement paused, as if the sight of me on the ground required confirmation before meaning action. Rachel stepped forward immediately, her presence assertive and commanding. She assured everyone that this was familiar, that I was prone to episodes like this, that I simply needed space and calm. Her certainty filled the air, and for a moment it seemed to seal the room in place. People hesitated, glancing at one another, unsure whose authority to trust. From where I lay, the ceiling light blurred into a hazy glow. My heart pounded unevenly, each beat struggling to arrive on time. Panic was no longer my concern. Survival was. Somewhere within that chaos, a voice cut through with clarity and force. A woman knelt beside me, her movement steady and practiced. She did not hesitate or soften her assessment. She examined my breathing, the color of my skin, the way my body responded to her touch, and quickly reached a conclusion that contradicted everything Rachel had been insisting upon. The tension in the room shifted. The certainty that had kept everyone frozen began to crack. Rachel resisted, appealing to her professional experience, but the moment no longer belonged to her. The woman beside me, Eleanor Hayes, spoke with a confidence earned from decades of experience in intensive care. She did not raise her voice, but her words carried authority that demanded attention. The message was unmistakable. Delay was dangerous. Waiting was no longer an option. Movement erupted around us. Someone stepped away to make a call. Another person cleared space. Chairs scraped against the floor as the neat arrangement of the gathering dissolved into purposeful disorder. I focused on the sensation of air entering my lungs, on staying present long enough for help to arrive. The world narrowed further, slipping toward a thin line of awareness where time stretched and compressed without warning. I could not see Rachel anymore. I sensed her presence somewhere above me, rigid and furious, but her voice no longer guided the room. That control had been taken away, replaced by action driven by necessity rather than image. The weight in my chest intensified, radiating outward, and my thoughts fragmented, drifting toward things unfinished and words unspoken. Then, faint at first, came the sound of sirens. It cut through the fog, distant but unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. It was the sound of interruption, of authority arriving from beyond the walls that had confined me. As the noise swelled, it carried with it a fragile sense of relief, even as my vision dimmed and strength drained away. I held on to that sound, letting it anchor me as the final distinction between before and after settled firmly into place. I woke to a ceiling that did not belong to me. The light above was too bright, too clean, and it took a few seconds to understand why my chest felt weighted and unfamiliar. The steady beeping beside the bed guided my awareness back into my body. Wires traced from my skin to a monitor, and the dull ache beneath my sternum pulsed with a rhythm that was no longer entirely my own. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, and with that smell came the knowledge that I had not simply fainted. I had crossed into something far more serious. A nurse noticed my eyes open and adjusted the blankets, her movements practiced and calm. Not long after, Dr. Michael Rosen came into the room. He spoke gently but without softness, explaining that I had suffered an acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. The words landed quietly, almost distant, and I absorbed them without panic. What followed mattered more. He told me that the delay in emergency services had significantly increased the risk, that minutes had mattered, and that it had been uncomfortably close. As he spoke, a cold understanding settled in. I had not nearly died because the signs were subtle or unpredictable. I had nearly died because I asked for help and was denied it. That realization carried its own weight, heavier than the pain medication could dull. When Dr. Rosen asked when the symptoms first began and how long it took before help was called, I answered honestly, feeling the gravity of my own words tighten around my chest in a new way. He nodded and made notes, his jaw set. He told me that everything surrounding my arrival had been documented by the paramedics and the staff who received me. I understood then that the night was no longer something my family could reinterpret or reshape. It had already been recorded, measured, and named by people whose responsibility was not to protect feelings, but lives. I lay still after he left, listening to the sounds of the hallway beyond the door. Voices drifted in and out, unfamiliar and urgent. Through the thin separation of the room, I caught fragments of conversation. Dr. Rosen speaking again, his tone firmer now. Rachel responding, defensive and sharp, insisting that I was prone to anxiety, that the situation had been misunderstood. There was a pause, then a reply I did not fully hear, only the unmistakable shift in the air that followed. Authority had moved. Noah's voice broke once, soft and strained, and then was gone. Tom said nothing. The silence that followed felt different from the silence in my living room earlier that night. This one carried consequence. Lying there, with my heart monitored and my breathing steadier, I understood the choice before me with unsettling clarity. For years, I had smoothed over discomfort, minimized concerns, and allowed my daughter's voice to speak louder than my own. I had done it out of love, out of habit, out of fear that standing firm would fracture what little harmony remained. But harmony built on dismissal was not safety. It was peril. I thought of David then, of how carefully he had planned, how often he had reminded me that independence was not selfishness. Somewhere in my files were documents he had insisted I keep, protections I had never wanted to need. As the beeping beside my bed continued its steady song, I made my decision. I would not explain this away. I would not absorb the blame to protect appearances. When I left this hospital, I would call my lawyer, review every safeguard David had put in place, and allow the truth to stand without apology. For the first time since the pain began, my chest felt lighter. Not because the danger had passed, but because I had stopped pretending it was my responsibility to make everyone else comfortable at the cost of my own life. If you're still watching and wondering what happens when the truth finally confronts consequences, comment number 6 below to let me know you've stayed with this journey. Because now we enter the fallout, where silence no longer protects anyone. Let's move on to Chapter 7. I remained in the cardiac unit for several days after the collapse, long enough for the immediate danger to pass, but not long enough to forget how close everything had come. My body felt fragile in a new way, as if it were still negotiating its right to keep going. Simple movements took effort. Sleep came in pieces. Yet beneath the physical weakness, my mind was clearer than it had been in years. The fog of denial had lifted, leaving behind a reality that was uncomfortable but unmistakable. The hospital staff moved around me with quiet efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting medications, and explaining each step of my recovery. Somewhere in the background, another process had already begun. Because Rachel worked within a healthcare system, the events surrounding my delayed treatment triggered an internal review. This was not something I requested, nor something I could stop. It was protocol. The nurses did not frame it as punishment, only as accountability. Rachel was asked to submit a formal statement. Later, I learned that she was also called into a meeting with her organization's legal department and ethics committee. The authorities she once relied upon no longer worked in her favor. This time, her proximity to medicine amplified the seriousness of what she had done instead of excusing it. For the first time, I was not the one quietly managing the damage. Calls began to come in from relatives who had been present that evening. Their voices sounded different now, hesitant and careful. They asked how I was feeling, whether I needed anything, and whether they could visit. None of them mentioned Rachel's version of events. The story had shifted, no longer filtered through her confidence. I felt both relieved and saddened by how quickly perspectives had changed once medical facts replaced personal narratives. True to my promise to myself, I asked the hospital social worker to help me arrange a meeting with Patrick Doyle, the attorney who had worked with my husband. When Patrick arrived, carrying a familiar leather briefcase, the weight of the moment settled fully into place. He reviewed documents David had updated before his death, outlining safeguards meant to protect me should questions of capacity or control ever arise. David's handwriting filled the margins with careful notes, reminders to reconsider trust if pressure appeared where it did not belong. Patrick explained that David had expressed concern about Rachel's growing fixation on financial oversight, even years ago. There were emails, formal addenda, and contingency clauses I had never wanted to examine too closely. Reading them now felt like hearing my husband's voice again, steady and protective. Grief and gratitude tangled uncomfortably in my chest. Then came a detail I had not known. Patrick mentioned that Rachel was under significant financial strain following a failed investment venture, large losses, mounting pressure. Suddenly, her urgency made sense in a way that was both clarifying and devastating. The need to control, to simplify, to dismiss obstacles like my health was no longer abstract. It was motivated. Noah visited me that evening, his shoulders hunched with guilt he did not deserve to carry. He apologized repeatedly for not calling emergency services, his voice cracking under the weight of what might have happened. I reassured him as best I could, understanding that fear had cornered him just as it had me. We sat quietly after that, sharing the kind of silence that does not demand fixing. As the days passed, I understood that consequences were unfolding beyond my room. Careers, relationships, and reputations were shifting under the pressure of truth. None of it felt triumphant. It felt necessary. What had happened could not be undone, but it could be acknowledged, recorded, and prevented from happening again. I left the hospital knowing something irreversible had occurred, not just in my heart, but in the structure of my family. The aftermath had begun, and although the path ahead was uncertain, it was no longer invisible. Returning home felt unfamiliar, even though nothing had physically changed. The same furniture stood where it always had. The same sunlight filtered through the curtains in the late afternoon, yet the house no longer absorbed me the way it once had. I moved more slowly now, careful with my steps, conscious of my heart in a way I had never been before. What surprised me most was not the lingering weakness in my body, but the quiet steadiness in my mind. The haze of hesitation that used to cloud my judgment had thinned, leaving clarity in its place. I spent the first day back simply observing. The sound of the refrigerator cycling on and off, the ticking clock in the hallway, the small stack of mail waiting on the table. Everything seemed sharper, stripped of the emotional padding I had wrapped around it for years. I no longer felt the impulse to minimize my discomfort or explain it away for someone else's benefit. The truth had asserted itself too forcefully for that. Rachel came the following evening. She did not knock the way she used to, confident and composed. This time her arrival was rushed, uneven, as if she were bracing herself for impact. She stepped inside and spoke immediately, pressing her urgency into the space. Her words circled around consequences, misunderstandings, and the danger of letting the situation grow. She needed me to clarify things, to soften what had already been recorded, to suggest that emotions had exaggerated the night's events. Her career, she implied, was at risk. I listened without interruption. That alone marked a change. In the past, I would have rushed to reassure her, to absorb blame and smooth edges before she finished speaking. Now I was aware of how carefully her explanation avoided responsibility. She did not ask how I felt. She did not acknowledge the fear or the damage. Her focus remained fixed on what she stood to lose. When she finally paused, I spoke calmly, choosing precision over comfort. I told her I would not rewrite the truth to protect her image. What happened had endangered my life, and pretending otherwise would only reinforce a pattern I was no longer willing to accept. I reminded her, gently but firmly, that concern does not look like control, and care does not silence someone's pain. I laid out boundaries that felt long overdue. Any contact between us would need to respect my autonomy. There would be no involvement in my medical decisions or finances. If there was ever to be space for rebuilding trust, it would require accountability, professional help, and time. None of these were offered as punishment. They were offered as necessity. Rachel's response shifted quickly from pleading to anger. She accused me of being dramatic, of choosing systems over family, of taking advantage of a situation that had spiraled out of control. This time, her words landed without taking root. I recognized defensiveness for what it was, and I did not chase it. After she left, the house felt quieter than usual, but not emptier. Noah sent a brief message later that night, checking in, reminding me that not everyone in that family web was blind to what had happened. His concern anchored me, reinforcing why my choice mattered beyond myself. Standing alone in my living room, I understood that finding a way forward did not mean repairing what was broken at any cost. It meant protecting what remained intact. My safety, my voice, and my right to be taken seriously were no longer negotiable. Whatever came next would build from that foundation, even if it meant standing alone to see it through. If you're still watching and ready to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below so I know you're here until the very end. What comes next is not about revenge, but about reckoning, resolution, and what remains after everything settles. Let's move to the conclusion. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in spirit. The fluorescent lights flattened everything beneath them, stripping warmth from the faces and turning even familiar gestures into something stiff and procedural. I took my seat on the wooden bench reserved for observers, aware of my heartbeat but no longer afraid of it. I was not there to be vindicated or avenged. I was there so the truth would be placed on record where it could no longer be reshaped. Across the aisle, Rachel sat beside her attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders slightly caved, hands folded too tightly in her lap. The confidence she once carried like armor was absent. Tom sat a few rows behind her, unreadable, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. I did not look for Noah. Some things did not belong in rooms like this. The proceedings moved steadily. Medical records were introduced, each page outlining timelines and measurements that left little room for interpretation. Paramedic reports detailed delays and obstruction. Hospital staff testified to the condition I arrived in and the narrow margin by which the outcome had shifted. When Eleanor Hayes took the stand, she spoke plainly, without drama, describing what she saw and why she acted. Her clarity cut through any remaining haze. This was not uncertainty. This was preventable risk. At one point, Rachel attempted to speak, framing the night as confusion fueled by concern. The judge stopped her, reminding her that this was not a forum for reinterpretation. The focus was conduct, not intention. As the facts stacked neatly into place, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The narrative was no longer personal, it was factual. The judge's ruling came without flourish. The language was legal but firm, naming the behavior for what it was, reckless endangerment. Particular emphasis was placed on Rachel's professional background, on the expectation of heightened awareness that accompanied it. The sentence reflected that gravity: community supervision, mandatory ethics education, financial restitution, permanent restriction from making or influencing my medical and financial decisions. Rachel did not cry. She simply sat still, absorbing the words as if they had drained the strength from her body. Tom lowered his head. No one spoke. I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that lines had been drawn where none existed before. Afterward, Patrick Doyle handed me a copy of the ruling. He called it closure and protection, both accurate in their way. The document was heavy in my hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. The matter was no longer confined to whispered justifications or private guilt. It had been given structure and consequence. Outside the courthouse, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I took a slow breath and stood still for a moment, letting the reality settle. My relationship with my daughter would never be what it had been, but perhaps that was already true long before this day. What remained was something different, grounded in boundaries I had once been too afraid to establish. I walked away knowing that justice did not restore what was lost, but it did protect what still mattered: my autonomy, my safety, and my right to be believed. Life did not return to what it was after the courtroom doors closed. Instead, it settled into something quieter, smaller, and far more honest. There was no victory lap, no sense of triumph waiting for me on the other side of accountability. What I felt was relief, subtle but profound, like stepping out of a room where I had been holding my breath for years. Recovery became part of my routine. I attended cardiac rehabilitation 3 times a week, learned how to listen to my body instead of dismissing it, and stopped apologizing for needing care. I kept my follow-up appointments, asked questions, and took rest seriously. Doing so felt less like surrender and more like reclaiming ground I had quietly given up over time. I simplified my life where I could. I sold the dining table that only ever filled with tension and kept the armchair by the window where David used to read the paper. The house grew lighter, as objects with too much history left, and only what still served me remained. My days became deliberate rather than reactive. With guidance from Patrick, I set aside part of the restitution to start a small local fund. It was modest by design, focused on practical needs for older adults who hesitated to seek help. Transportation to medical appointments, short notice evaluations, legal consultations when family dynamics became complicated. Each request reminded me of how easily silence can masquerade as strength. I began speaking at community centers, not as an advocate or expert, but as a woman who had learned the cost of not being believed. I told my story plainly, without embellishment, and watched as others recognized pieces of their own lives in it. Sometimes the room stayed quiet afterward. Sometimes people cried. Either way, the silence no longer felt dangerous. Rachel sent one message months later. It was long, conflicted, edged with resentment. She spoke of erasure, of unfairness, of how difficult it was to be excluded from something that bore her last name. I read it once and did not respond. The boundary I had drawn was not punishment. It was maintenance. Noah still checked in. He asked about my health, my garden, the books I was reading. Our connection required no effort, no explanation. It simply existed. One evening, I stood on my porch as the sun lowered behind the trees, the air cool and steady. I breathed in deeply, unafraid of what my body might say back. What remained were not the relationships I had tried to preserve at any cost, but the truth I had finally allowed to stand. And that, I had learned, was enough to carry me forward. In the end, this story is not about wrongdoing or punishment, but about the quiet moment when truth finally outweighs fear. It is about realizing that silence, often mistaken for peace, can slowly become its own form of harm. Life has a way of asking hard questions late, when answers matter most, and time no longer feels endless. Choosing honesty over comfort, boundaries over approval, and self-respect over guilt is rarely easy, but it is necessary. Real strength does not appear through dramatic gestures, but through clarity and the courage to finally choose oneself. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, consider liking, following, and subscribing so more meaningful voices can reach those who need them.